In a city where every step could be your last, one man is about to change everything. What happens tonight will keep you guessing. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. The best is yet to come. Iron City never truly slept. The hum of distant machinery mixed with the flickering neon lights that painted its cracked sidewalks in shades of blue and orange. The air carried the scent of burnt oil and rain, and in the distance, trains wailed like ghosts passing through forgotten stations. On nights like this, when the wind whispered between the steel skeletons of old factories, the city felt alive in a restless, uneasy way. Among the shadows of Pine Street, one of Iron City's oldest and roughest neighborhoods, stood a place known as the Blue Horizon. Once a jazz bar for steelworkers and musicians, it had become a quiet refuge for those who still believed in something pure amid the decay. Its cracked sign buzzed lazily, half-lit, and the faint sound of a saxophone drifted from inside, low, mournful, and full of soul. Steven Seagal stepped out of a yellow cab, the door closing behind him with a dull thud. The driver, a young man with tired eyes, looked at him in the mirror. "You sure about this place, mister?" "Pine Street ain't what it used to be." Steven adjusted his long black coat and nodded slowly. "Danger's just another word for the unprepared," he said, in that calm, gravel-deep tone that never rose above necessity. The cab drove off, its taillights fading into the mist, leaving Steven alone on the sidewalk. He took a slow breath and began walking. Each step echoed off the old brick walls, measured and deliberate. His ponytail caught the dim light from a street lamp, and the reflection in his dark glasses showed nothing but empty road. To anyone watching, he was just another man passing through the night. But there was something in the way he moved, an invisible stillness, a discipline that spoke of years spent mastering control. Steven wasn't in Iron City for trouble. He'd been invited to a veterans' charity event earlier that week, a quiet recognition for men who'd given more than they could afford. The event was over now, and all he wanted was a drink, a quiet place, maybe a song to remind him that the world hadn't gone completely cold. But Iron City had other plans. As he walked, he noticed the emptiness of the street. Stores were shuttered, graffiti covered the walls, and somewhere a bottle shattered. A faint laugh came from an alley nearby, followed by the clinking of metal. Steven didn't break his pace. He'd been in places far worse than this war zones, broken cities, streets that stank of fear. Pine Street was no different. The real danger wasn't in the sound of footsteps. It was in the silence that followed them. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Shadows shifted at the mouth of a narrow alley. 6 men stepped out, their boots scuffing against the wet ground. They were young, dressed in leather jackets with coiled serpent patches stitched onto the sleeves. Their leader, a tall man with a flame tattoo curling up his neck, grinned when he saw Steven. His name was Troy Blaze Douglas, leader of the Iron Serpents, the gang that ruled this side of town. Blaze had built his reputation on intimidation extortion, broken bones, and the kind of violence that made people lock their doors before sunset. Steven stopped, a few paces away from the group. Blaze smirked and tossed his cigarette to the ground. Well, look what we got here. Some tourist thinks he can walk down our street." The gang spread out, forming a loose semicircle around him. Behind them, the faint music from the Blue Horizon carried through the air, soft, melancholy, almost ironic in its calm. Steven said nothing. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his jacket and looked at the bar's entrance a few yards ahead. Blaze took a step forward, his voice dripping arrogance. "Hey, old man, you deaf? I said you're in Iron Serpent territory. You walk here, you pay a toll." One of his men laughed and swung a chain lazily in his hand, the metal clinking with a dull rhythm. A couple of bystanders on the opposite sidewalk froze, unsure whether to watch or run. The tension thickened, like the charged air before a storm. Stephen's voice finally broke the silence, calm and low. "I'm not looking for trouble, just heading to that bar." His words were measured, not a challenge, but a warning wrapped in patience. Blaze's grin widened. "Not looking for trouble?" He chuckled and glanced at his crew. "Hear that, boys? He's not looking for trouble. Guess we found him instead." The laughter that followed was short and cruel. One of the younger serpents, a wiry man with a scar under his eye, stepped forward and shoved Stephen's shoulder. "You don't belong here," he hissed. The push barely moved Stephen, who simply stood there, steady as stone. The quiet that followed was almost worse than the laughter. Even Blaze paused for a second, studying the man who didn't flinch. Then he reached for the bat hanging from his belt and smacked it lightly against his palm, the sound echoing through the street. "Maybe he's one of those hero types," Blaze said, smirking, "thinking he can just stroll through Iron City like he's in a movie." Stephen turned his head slightly, the neon glow reflecting off his glasses. "I'm no hero," he said quietly, "just passing through. Let me by." The tone of his voice carried weight, not anger, but certainty. Blaze twirled the bat and stepped closer. "You think you can ignore me, old man?" The grin returned, but this time it was thinner, sharper. For a moment, the city seemed to hold its breath. A woman standing near the bar whispered something to the man beside her. The sound of the saxophone drifted through the door. One last note before silence. Then, with a sudden motion, another serpent lunged. The first mistake. Stephen moved faster than the eye could follow. His hand caught the attacker's wrist, twisted, and sent him crashing to the ground. The bat clattered away, spinning across the pavement. Another came in swinging, but Stephen sidestepped, his elbow connecting sharply with the man's chest. 2 down, 4 standing, and Blaze's grin finally faded. The onlookers gasped. Someone raised a phone, recording. Blaze barked a curse and charged, his bat slicing through the air. Stephen ducked, caught his arm, and used his momentum to throw him backward. Blaze hit the pavement hard, rolling to a stop near the curb. His men froze. Stephen straightened, his coat barely disturbed. He looked around, his voice calm but final. "You still want that toll?" No one answered. For the first time that night, the iron serpents hesitated. But from the shadows of the alley came a new sound, the metallic click of a gun being cocked. A 7th figure stepped forward, half hidden in the dark. His voice shook slightly, but the weapon in his hand did not. "Don't move, hero," he said, the barrel glinting under the neon light. Stephen didn't blink. His hand stayed loose at his sides. The crowd went silent again, the only sound the low hum of the Blue Horizon sign and the distant wail of a siren somewhere far away. The first chapter closed with that moment of stillness, as Iron City itself seemed to pause between violence and silence. The wind tugged at Stephen's coat. The saxophone inside the bar picked up a lonely tune, and the gun remained pointed straight at his heart. The street was a frozen picture of tension, the gun aimed straight at Stephen's chest, while the other serpents stood motionless, breathing heavily and staring at their fallen leader sprawled on the pavement. The young man with the pistol stepped closer, his voice unsteady, his hand trembling just enough for Stephen to notice. The man couldn't have been more than 20, his face half hidden under a hood, a streak of fear flashing behind his anger. "You think you're tough, huh?" he muttered. "Nobody makes fools of the iron serpents." Stephen's voice was calm, almost gentle. "You don't want to do this." The faint glow of the Blue Horizon sign flickered, throwing uneven light across the alley. A few bystanders began to whisper, phones raised, their eyes wide with the thrill of seeing something they would later post online with shaky captions. Stephen didn't look at them. His attention was fixed entirely on the man with the gun. He had seen that look before, the mixture of fear and pride that always ended the same way. Behind him, Blaze groaned, dragging himself up on one elbow, his anger quickly replacing his pain. "Pull the trigger," he barked, blood on his lip. "Show him what happens when someone messes with us." The young man flinched at the order, but didn't shoot. His finger hovered near the trigger, uncertain. Stephen slowly raised one hand, palm outward. "You've got a choice," he said evenly. "Right now. You can end a life, or you can end a mistake." The crowd murmured. The air felt heavy, charged with something beyond fear, the pull between violence and control. The gunman's breathing grew shallow, his knuckles whitened. For a second, time stretched thin, the entire street balancing on the edge of one decision. Then Stephen moved. It wasn't a rush or a jump. It was a blur, an instinct honed by years of survival. He stepped forward, twisted the man's wrist, and the weapon fell with a clatter to the asphalt. The young man cried out as Stephen's movement carried through, pulling him off balance and down onto one knee. The pistol slid across the pavement and stopped at Blaze's feet. For a brief second, Blaze's eyes flicked to it. But before he could reach, Stephen's boot came down hard on the weapon, pinning it in place. A hush fell over the street. The confrontation that had begun as mockery had turned into something else entirely. The iron serpents, who had built their reputation on fear, were now silent, breathing raggedly, the truth of their defeat spreading through them like cold water. Stephen released the young man's arm and stepped back, his movements measured and calm, as though violence had been nothing more than a reflex. "Go home," he said. "You're done for tonight." The gunman looked up, shame written across his face, then staggered to his feet and backed away. Blaze stood now, clutching his ribs, his pride more wounded than his body. "You think this means anything?" he spat. "You've just made enemies in this city. The serpents don't forget." Stephen looked at him, and the faintest trace of something, not pity, not contempt, but understanding, passed across his face. "Then maybe it's time you remembered what it means to lose." He turned toward the blue horizon, pushing the door open as murmurs followed him inside. The crowd, stunned, began to applaud quietly, the sound uncertain at first but growing louder, echoing through Pine Street like a heartbeat. Inside, the blue horizon was bathed in dim light and the soft haze of cigarette smoke. The saxophone resumed its lonely song as if nothing had happened. Patrons stared as Stephen took a seat at the bar, nodding once to the bartender, a gray-haired man polishing glasses with slow, deliberate motions. "Whiskey," Stephen said simply. The bartender poured without a word, sliding the glass forward. "Heard some noise outside," the man said finally. "Sounded bad." Stephen took a sip, eyes fixed on the mirror behind the bar. "It's over," he replied. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Moments later, someone at the far end of the bar glanced toward the window. "You might have started something, mister," he whispered. On the street, Blaze and his remaining crew were regrouping, anger building under their skin. A few of them were already making calls, and their voices carried through the open door. Curses, promises of payback. The Blue Horizon's regulars exchanged nervous looks. Even the saxophonist stopped playing for a second. Stephen finished his drink and placed the glass down gently, his expression unreadable. "They won't stop tonight," the bartender said softly. Stephen nodded. "No, but I'll be ready when they don't." Outside, the serpents' bikes roared to life. Their engines filled the street with a sound that was both a warning and a challenge. Blaze spat on the ground, his pride burning hotter than the bruises spreading across his jaw. "He wants to play hero?" he shouted over the noise. "Fine, we'll show him what happens to heroes." They rode off into the darkness, their taillights vanishing into the maze of Iron City's alleys. Back in the bar, Stephen sat in silence, letting the whiskey's warmth spread through him. The city outside was alive again. Sirens, shouts, the restless hum that never stopped. He'd seen this pattern too many times before. Men like Blaze always came back. Fear fed them, and pride kept them from seeing reason. But there was something different about this city, something brittle. The people had been afraid for too long, and now, after what they'd just witnessed, that fear had cracked. It was small, but it was enough. A young woman near the jukebox was typing rapidly on her phone. "He took them all down," she whispered to her friend. "No guns, no backup, just one guy. It's already online." Within minutes, the clip from the street began to circulate. Stephen's calm defiance, the disarmed gang, the moment the crowd cheered. The caption read, "One man stands up to iron serpents." Outside, the night grew thicker. The neon sign of the blue horizon flickered again, casting Stephen's reflection against the bar window, calm, silent, and waiting. He could almost feel the city watching him, like it was holding its breath for what came next. Somewhere in the distance, the echo of motorcycle engines faded into silence, but he knew that wasn't the end. It was just the quiet before the next storm. And when it came, he'd be there, steady as ever, ready to face it. The silence that followed was heavier than the fight itself. The air outside the blue horizon carried the faint hum of engines in the distance, a reminder that trouble never stayed gone for long in Iron City. Inside, Stephen sat quietly, his reflection caught in the mirror behind the bar. The people around him whispered in low tones, replaying what they had seen, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The bartender, a man named Hank, set down another drink in front of Stephen without asking. "That won't be the end of it," he said quietly. Stephen didn't look up. It never is. Outside, the streets had gone still again, that deceptive stillness that always came before something worse. Minutes passed. The music had stopped. A faint vibration ran through the floorboards, soft but growing, a low growl that everyone in the bar recognized before they even heard the first roar of the engines. The serpents were returning, and they weren't coming quietly this time. Stephen stood, his movement calm, measured. The bartender's voice carried a hint of fear. "You can leave through the back. They won't follow if you disappear." Stephen turned his head slightly. "I don't run." He stepped toward the door, the shadow swallowing him as he emerged back into the night. Pine Street was no longer empty. The crowd had gathered again, drawn by the sound of engines and the weight of curiosity. Phones were raised, their small lights flickering like fireflies in the dark. Then the bikes appeared, 4 of them, slicing through the fog, their headlights glaring. The iron serpents had brought reinforcements. The lead bike stopped with a screech, and the man who dismounted was not Blaze. This one was taller, older, and colder. He wore a black leather jacket covered in stitched patches and scars from old fights. His name was Derek Raven Hall, one of the founding members of the Serpents, a man whose reputation stretched far beyond this city. Raven's boots hit the ground, and the air seemed to shift. He looked around, surveying the street like a general sizing up a battlefield. His men formed a line behind him, their weapons gleaming faintly under the street lights. "Which one of you clowns let this happen?" he asked, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the noise. Blaze stepped forward, bruised and humiliated, pointing at Stephen. "That's him. The old man thinks he owns Pine Street." Raven's gaze found Stephen, lingering just long enough to sense that this wasn't a man like the others he'd beaten. "You've made quite a mess," he said, his tone almost casual. "You could have just walked away." Stephen's response came with quiet finality. "Some things aren't worth walking away from." The crowd edged back as the 2 men faced each other. Raven laughed, not mocking, but curious. "You talk like someone who still believes this place can be fixed." Stephen's eyes never wavered. "Belief isn't the problem. Fear is." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, even the engines seemed to quiet. Blaze growled something under his breath and raised his bat again, but Raven stopped him with a hand. "You've already embarrassed us once. This time, I'll handle it." He rolled his shoulders, picked up a heavy chain from his belt, and swung it lazily, testing its weight. "You ready for this, old man?" Stephen didn't move. His breathing was steady, his stance relaxed, his awareness absolute. The first swing came fast, the chain slicing through the air with a sharp whistle. Stephen sidestepped, caught Raven's wrist, and turned the motion back on him, the chain slipping from his grip. The crowd gasped. Another serpent charged from the side, and Stephen dropped low, sweeping his legs out from under him. Every movement was precise, efficient. No wasted effort, no anger. The fight unfolded like a pattern he'd practiced 1,000 times before. One attacker swung a pipe. Stephen caught it mid-motion, twisted it free, and sent the man sprawling. Another came in from behind, and Stephen spun, elbow connecting with the man's jaw, a sound like thunder cracking in the narrow street. Blaze tried to rush in again, shouting curses, but Stephen stopped him with a single movement, gripping his wrist and locking him in place until the bat slipped from his fingers. The younger man gasped in pain, the fight draining from him completely. Raven, still on his feet, stared at Stephen with something that wasn't quite hate, more like realization. The crowd was no longer silent. Cheers began to break through the fear, soft at first, but growing louder with every second. The people of Pine Street, once afraid to even look at the serpents, were shouting now, their voices filling the air. Raven stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. He met Stephen's eyes and saw no triumph there, only calm. "You think you've won?" he hissed. Stephen shook his head. "Winning isn't the point." Behind him, the glow of the blue horizon's neon reflected off the wet pavement, painting the scene in ghostly blue light. The serpents, who were still standing, hesitated, glancing between their defeated leader and the man who refused to back down. Then Stephen spoke, his voice steady and clear enough for everyone to hear. "It ends tonight. These streets don't belong to you anymore." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Raven lowered his gaze, the fight leaving him as quietly as it had begun. "You don't know this city," he said softly. "It'll eat you alive." Stephen turned toward the bar, his silhouette framed against the neon glow. "Maybe," he replied, "but not tonight." As he walked back toward the blue horizon, the crowd erupted in applause. Some were recording, some were just watching in stunned silence, but all of them felt something shift. For the first time in years, Pine Street didn't feel ruled by fear. The serpents gathered their wounded and retreated, their engines roaring one last time before fading into the distance. Inside the bar, the saxophone started again, slow and soulful, echoing through the walls like the sound of something long forgotten returning to life. Stephen sat down at the counter, and Hank looked at him with a faint, knowing smile. "Guess it's over," the bartender said. Stephen took a sip of his drink and watched the reflection of the street in the glass. "No," he murmured. "It's just beginning." Outside, the lights of Iron City flickered against the night sky, and for the first time, the darkness didn't seem so endless. The next night came heavy with rain. Iron City's streets glistened under the glow of neon lights, each puddle reflecting the fractured signs of old diners, pawn shops, and the flickering glow of the blue horizon. The fight from the night before had already become a legend. Videos flooded the city's social networks clips of Stephen disarming men twice his size, facing down the iron serpents without raising his voice. Comments filled every thread, a mix of disbelief, admiration, and fear. Some called him a hero, Others warned that he'd only started a war. Inside the bar, the regulars talked quietly, voices low, every glance toward the door edged with expectation. The streets outside might have seemed calm, but Iron City never let go of a grudge. Stephen sat alone at his usual place, the sound of rain tapping gently against the windows. Hank wiped down the counter. "They won't just let it go," the bartender said finally. Stephen nodded slightly, his eyes distant. "I know." He had seen this pattern too many times. Violence fed on pride, and pride never knew when to stop. In the reflection of the glass, he could see the empty street beyond the bar's neon glow, a hollow silence that only meant one thing. The city was holding its breath. Then came the sound, deep, rhythmic, unmistakable. Engines. Not one or two, but several. The noise rolled through the streets like thunder, the kind that announces a storm long before it breaks. People inside the blue horizon went still, heads turning toward the door. Outside, the rain turned silver under the approaching headlights. 4 motorcycles came into view, black and sleek, cutting through the wet night. The Iron Serpents had returned, and this time their leader wasn't Blaze or one of his bruised lieutenants. The man who dismounted first was tall, his presence commanding in a way that made even the onlookers shrink back. His name was Derek Raven Hall, the founder of the Serpents, a figure both feared and respected across the city's underground. Raven stepped off his bike with deliberate calm, the chain wrapped around his wrist glinting under the streetlight. His men fanned out behind him, each armed with something blunt, heavy, and eager for payback. The rain hissed on the pavement, and the only other sound was the low hum of the blue horizon's flickering sign. The door to the bar creaked open, and Stephen stepped out into the night, the neon outlining him in cold, blue light. He looked at the scene without fear, his movements slow and deliberate as he adjusted his coat. The crowd that had gathered under nearby awnings whispered his name, like it was a rumor come to life. Raven's voice was low, but sharp. "You made quite the impression," he said, stepping closer. "My boys tell me you embarrassed them. In my city, that's not something we let slide." Stephen studied him for a long moment before answering. "Then maybe it's time you stopped calling it your city," the onlookers murmured, and Blaze, standing behind Raven with bruises still fresh on his face, clenched his fists. "Kill him," Blaze hissed. Raven didn't move. Instead, he swung the chain in a slow arc, testing the air, watching the way Stephen didn't even flinch. "You think you can fix this place with your fists?" he asked. "You think these people are worth it?" Stephen's eyes didn't waver. "Everyone's worth saving until they decide not to be." Raven's smirk faded. He flicked his wrist, and the chain snapped through the air towards Stephen, fast and hard. Stephen sidestepped, the motion smooth, his hand catching Raven's arm and twisting it down with precision. The chain fell, clattering onto the wet pavement. A gasp went through the crowd. One of the Serpents charged, swinging a bat. Stephen pivoted, caught the weapon mid-swing, and drove his shoulder into the man's chest. Another lunged with a knife. Stephen turned the blade aside, sending the attacker sprawling into a puddle. It was over in seconds, a blur of control, precision, and restraint. Raven regrouped, breathing hard now, anger cutting through his calm. He picked up his chain again and lunged, but Stephen caught him mid-motion, his hand locking around Raven's wrist, his other arm moving in a fluid arc that sent the older man crashing to the ground. The chain clattered again, this time landing beside Blaze's boots. The younger man bent to pick it up but froze when Stephen's gaze met his. There was no threat in those eyes, just a warning that went deeper than fear. "You can walk away," Stephen said quietly. "All of you can. This ends here." The sound of rain filled the silence. The Serpents hesitated, looking to Raven, but their leader didn't move. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by something heavier understanding. Slowly, He pushed himself up to his knees, the water streaming down his face. "You think you've won," he muttered. Stephen stepped back, his voice steady. "I didn't come here to win." The crowd erupted in applause. It started as a ripple and grew into a wave, echoing through the narrow street. The people of Pine Street, long afraid to even look at the serpents, were now shouting, clapping, filming. Raven's men backed away, their anger dissolving into confusion and disbelief. The chain slipped from Blaze's hand and hit the ground with a dull clang. The noise of engines started again, low and uncertain. One by one, the serpents mounted their bikes, and when Raven finally stood, he gave Stephen one last long look. "This city doesn't forgive," he said, his tone a warning more than a threat. "Then it's time it learned how," Stephen replied. The serpents revved their engines and disappeared into the night, their red tail lights fading into the rain. Stephen turned back toward the blue horizon. The people parted as he passed, some reaching out to touch his arm, others just whispering his name like it meant safety. Inside, the music started again. Slow, melancholic, a tune that seemed to wash the blood and fear from the air. Hank looked up from behind the counter as Stephen sat back down. "You're some kind of miracle, you know that," the bartender said quietly. Stephen didn't answer right away. He stared at the mirror, at the reflection of the street now empty, except for the soft glow of the neon light. "No," he said finally. "Just a reminder." Outside, the rain began to ease, and for the first time in years, Pine Street looked different. The fear that had lived there so long was cracked open, washed clean by something stronger. As Stephen finished his drink, a few of the bar's patrons stepped outside, talking, laughing, their voices light. The city wasn't fixed, not yet, but something inside it had shifted. For the first time in a long time, Iron City was breathing again. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving Iron City washed clean under a pale gray sky. The streets glistened, as if they had been stripped of their grime, the air lighter than it had been in years. News traveled faster than the sunrise. By the time the first coffee shops opened their doors, the story had already reached every corner of the city. Videos of the fight spread through every platform, shared with captions that carried both awe and disbelief. One man stands up to the Iron Serpents. Stephen Seagal saves Pine Street, justice in the heart of Iron City. People who had spent years whispering about crime and corruption now spoke openly about what had happened. The serpents, once untouchable, had been driven from their own territory. For the first time in memory, people walked without looking over their shoulders. Inside the blue horizon, the day began quietly. The smell of coffee and wet asphalt filled the room. Hank stood behind the counter, wiping down glasses as sunlight filtered through the blinds. Stephen sat at the bar in the same seat he always took, his posture calm, his eyes distant. The television in the corner replayed shaky footage of him disarming Raven, the sound of cheering echoing faintly from the speakers. Hank looked up at him. "They're calling you a hero now," he said. Stephen didn't smile. "Heroes don't last long in places like this." The bartender shook his head. "Maybe not, but people need something to believe in. You gave them that." Outside, the city had begun to change. Store owners who used to close early were sweeping their sidewalks, unlocking their doors before noon. Children ran through puddles, their laughter bouncing off the walls that had once carried only the sound of engines and fear. In the narrow alleys where the serpents used to roam, murals began to appear overnight. Bright colors against the gray brick painted words that said things like, "No more fear," and "This street is ours." What had started as one man's stand had turned into a quiet revolution. Stephen walked through the city that afternoon, his boots echoing on the wet pavement. Everywhere he went, People nodded to him or whispered his name. Some tried to thank him. Others simply met his gaze with something he hadn't seen here before: respect without fear. He stopped at a corner where a group of neighbors was working together to scrub graffiti off a wall. A little boy looked up and smiled shyly. "You're the guy from the video," he said. Stephen crouched down so they were eye to eye. "I'm just someone who didn't walk away," he answered softly. The boy nodded, as if that explained everything. Later that week, the police finally moved in to clear the last of the Serpent's strongholds. They found empty warehouses and abandoned bikes, but no one waiting to fight. Raven and Blaze had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but broken chains and silence. For once, the silence didn't feel dangerous. It felt earned. That night, the blue horizon filled with more people than it had in years. The saxophone played louder, the conversations were brighter, and the laughter felt real. On the wall near the entrance, someone had mounted a small metal plaque. It read, "For courage and dignity, the night fear died." Hank poured Stephen another glass of whiskey and leaned against the counter. "They'll be talking about this for years," he said. "About the man who walked into Iron City and changed it." Stephen glanced at the plaque and then back at Hank. "I didn't change anything," he said. "They did." The bartender smiled faintly. "Maybe. But someone had to show them how." Stephen finished his drink and set the glass down, the sound small but final. "Then my job's done." He stood, adjusting his coat as the music swelled behind him. He stepped outside into the cool night air. The streets were alive again, glowing with light and laughter. Couples walked hand in hand. A street vendor served coffee from a cart near the curb. Somewhere nearby, a group of musicians played, their notes drifting through the open air. The city no longer felt like it was waiting for violence. It felt like it was breathing again. Stephen walked down Pine Street, past the glowing sign of the blue horizon, his shadow stretching long under the street lights. A woman standing nearby recognized him and called out, "Thank you." He paused, turning slightly. "Don't thank me," he said quietly. "Thank yourselves." Then he kept walking, his footsteps fading into the sound of music and distant laughter. Days later, Hank found an envelope left on the bar. Inside was a handwritten note signed only by the people of Pine Street. It thanked Stephen for his courage, for reminding them that strength wasn't in fists or fear, but in standing together. They wrote that the children played freely now, that the bar stayed open late, that the lights on their street seemed to shine brighter. Hank smiled as he read it, then tucked it into the frame of the plaque on the wall. Far from Iron City, Stephen sat in a small apartment overlooking the river. The skyline shimmered with new light. He held the letter in his hands for a long time before setting it down beside his glass. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft but certain. "A city isn't defined by its shadows," he said, looking out at the water. "It's defined by the people who face them." He stood, walked to the window, and watched the lights of Iron City flicker in the distance. The world would move on. The city would forget his name. But that was how it should be. In the end, there were no headlines, no monuments, no grand farewell. Just the sound of wind through the streets, laughter echoing where fear used to live, and the quiet figure of a man who had come to remind a broken city what dignity looked like. Stephen Seagal disappeared into the night once more, his story now part of Iron City's heartbeat, his lesson carved into its streets. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand when others cannot. The night is over, but the story is just beginning. If you liked it, leave a like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This is only the beginning of what's to come.